the three biggest mistakes that predominantly food retailers were making at the time was the first one is this kind of knee-jerk reaction to the consumer demand of you must stop using plastic. So very quickly, all the retailers made promises and plans to reduce or remove plastic, in its entirety or in massive numbers, 50% reduction over 5 years, and all these sort of promises, but without really a plan or any idea of how they were going to do it.
When we analyse the construction industry, we often focus on the building cost. However, the true cost of inefficiencies, rework, and waste is frequently underestimated. In episode 9, we spoke to Caner and Jayan from Gamma AR and how augmented reality can help reduce some of these reoccurring problems. But what about the tangible? Construction is all about tangible, right? The physical products, the fabric of a build, and everything that goes inside it. Where did these products come from? What are they made up of? And where will they end up? From raw materials to on-site waste, there is a lot to consider here. According to the CPA, Construction Products Association, in 2018, the UK produced 68 million tonnes of construction and demolition waste, of which 5 million tonnes went to landfill. With the bigger picture always focusing on the actual product this intro has covered, today I want to turn your attention to the periphery and parts of a product we don't generally discuss: the packaging. So let's wrap this intro up. Roger Wright is the Waste Strategy and Packaging Manager at Biffa, bringing his retail experience to the construction industry, more specifically, bringing his experience into waste management. By developing this unique service, Roger looks to help businesses think differently about their packaging, the packaging they consume, and make sure that that becomes more circular in its approach. Roger designs out the materials they don't need and implements the scalable alternatives they do. It's almost counterintuitive, as doing this will invariably reduce the waste created and therefore reduce the requirements for that waste to be managed. But it's certainly a strategy that Biffa and Roger wholeheartedly believe is the right one. So, Roger, welcome. And would you like to add anything to that intro?
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for the welcome. Would I add anything to the welcome? Yeah, I am relatively new to the waste management sector. I've only been in this sector for 3.5 years. So I'm still learning. I'm still learning day to day about lots of new stuff because of my entire career has really been in packaging design, packaging technology. But now I've been in waste management for 3 years. I don't think I'd go back to retail or back to manufacturing. I think it's such a great sector to be in. So I'd encourage anyone listening to this that it's a great career for anyone who's interested in any material function of any material or any sort of issue around the circular economy to get involved with, to be honest.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth reiterating that point simply because when you think of waste or, and I suppose Biffa being a big brand in that perspective, the red big dump bins or whatever you call them, it can be so easy to just see that as waste and there's nothing circular about it, where that's far from the truth.
Absolutely. I mean, I try and do anything but talk about bins and trucks if I can help it.
Yeah.
And if that's what our customers really want to talk about, that's the day-to-day stuff. The bins and the trucks, that almost looks after itself. But it's why I find this role so interesting is because we can get into the other stuff, the really hard stuff they haven't thought about. And like you say, it's almost like the elephant in the room is we want to collect less waste from you, Mr. Customer or Mrs. Customer. And they go, do you really want to do that? And actually, yeah, we do. That's our raison d'etre. That's the reason to do this, because if we don't do that, well, first of all, they're going to go to someone that can. but B, it actually helps us because we are at our core a recycling business, not a general waste processing business,
Mm.
which unfortunately some of our competitors do would rather incinerate that waste than do anything meaningful with it, and that's not where we are at all. So we are genuinely trying to move material up the waste hierarchy from landfill or energy recovery to something better.
Okay, well, let's start off then by looking at some of that waste, and probably
Yeah,
one of the more obvious or predominant waste materials that we currently have in the UK and in the world, I would say. But according to SwiftPack, about 40% of plastic packaging used in construction sites ends up in landfills.
yeah,
Most of that can be, as you know, be recycled, reused, or even replaced, but for various reasons it isn't. And I think the decomposition time frame is about 1,000 years. So, next time I open a pack of ham and put that in the recycling, if it's not going somewhere that's going to use it, then it's going to way outlive me, which is bizarre. And if you think about the amount of plastic we utilize, particularly in construction and packaging, that can stack up really quickly.
yeah.
So, how have we got to this stage where plastic is the enemy?
How have we got here? This is a relatively recent phenomenon, actually. I think there's almost like there's probably a 10-year journey that we've been on as consumers and as people working for businesses. I think back to a chap called Boyan Slat. You might know that name. He was the chap that built a great big scoop to scoop the garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean. He did
Oh
this in
yeah,
2000. He did it in 2013 and made a big. Obviously, he was doing something very worthwhile, but it was the first time I think we became aware of this floating island of plastic in the sea and other materials. And I think slowly but surely people have sort of dug into this problem of waste in the environment, and particularly focusing on plastic. And the next thing that people might remember is Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall talking about coffee cups in 2015. Remember when he basically said to the world, on BBC, a coffee cup isn't just a paper cup; it's got a plastic lining inside it. And by the way, that makes it really difficult to recycle. And everyone was kind of shocked to learn that their coffee cups had actually got plastic in it. Who knew? Sort of thing. But I mean, it's obvious to a packaging designer, but actually, people didn't realise that made it really hard to recycle. And then, of course, the big one was Blue Planet 2 in 2017, and that really blew the doors off what people thought they knew about plastics and materials in general and what was happening in the real world. And of course, at that point in time, government suddenly woke up and thought we need to do something about it because of the noise and the very vocal sort of response to that problem. But I think it had been building up for probably 4 or 5 years to that point. I think everyone was aware of the problem, and I think everyone intuitively knew that a lot of the material they were recycling, in inverted commas, probably wasn't going to get recycled. Or they sort of knew that there was a problem with this plastic stuff that they were using every day, and this kind of, I mean, rightly or wrongly, it made everyone aware of what they were doing, and I guess we'll probably look at the policy bits later in the chat, but that then drove the policy of the UK government, mirrored all around the world by lots of other governments in the developed world to do a similar thing. I mean, only now if you're watching the news at the moment in depth, you'll see that there's a meeting of governments in Nairobi in Kenya talking about a new resolution to reduce the amount of plastics that are being manufactured and therefore potentially littered in our rivers and oceans. It's obviously something that we watch very carefully because I think it could potentially limit the amount of plastic materials that's manufactured going forward, and I think that would be a good thing. So this notion of plastic as an issue isn't going away either. It's just getting more and more prevalent, and I think the link between plastic production and environmental destruction is quite close. Actually, there is a link between the two things. But what I say to people is that you've got to not consider it as evil. It's actually a miraculous material in many settings. And I think reflecting on the topics of your discussions, plastic makes buildings possible, doesn't it? In an efficient way, and plastic can actually prevent waste. Ultimately, especially with food packaging, plastic prevents waste, which is counterintuitive to what you might think about plastic. So we have to be. I think the dial swung massively to plastic is evil, but the dial is coming somewhere back to the middle now, and people are realising there is nuance in the debate. Yes, we should make less of it. Yes, as plastics get smaller, the problems get bigger because it's entering the food waste. It's entering the food stream into fish and then into us. We know that, but there is still a place for the right use of plastic. What I say to people is I'm not here to sell them plastic or packaging of any type, but I will recommend plastic packaging if it's right for what you're doing, and if we or someone else can come along and collect it and recycle it at the end of its first life, if you like. So it has been an ongoing sort of narrative over the last 10 years, perhaps a bit longer. And the dial has moved around in that time, but it's never going to go away as an issue. Quite rightly.
I always find it interesting for just purely from a waste perspective that if you were to go to any major city, if you were to walk around that city of a morning, early morning, and you see all the waste being waited to be collected, because that's the most efficient way to do it, put it on the side. If you stand there and just look at what you can see or wherever you're walking, that is a small, tiny proportion of all the world's waste. And it hurts my head a little to think about, okay, and this isn't just done once, it's done on a daily basis, 365 days a year, or at least 364 or whatever it might be. And it's like, that is a lot of waste. Like it's quite hard to comprehend it. You can throw massive numbers out there, but it's really hard to comprehend how much waste we as humans create, let alone as an individual or a shop or a street or a city. It's phenomenal, really.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think you mentioned 40% of plastics a minute ago in terms of what was recovered. But actually, it can be as low as 5-6% of certain materials that are recovered and recycled in the plastics world anyway. But it can be as high as 80 to 85%, depending on what it is. So you end up landing on 40%, which is probably about average when you look at all the different plastic types. But all the good ones get badged with the worst ones. They all get dragged down with the worst ones.
Yeah.
I say worst ones. Worst ones are only plastics that are just too difficult to grab a hold of. So the light soft plastics, which tend to fly away in the environment, or are so light that it's really quite difficult to make a viable business case to recycle them, because you need a lot of it to make it worth collecting and recycling. Whereas hard plastics are a much more viable proposition.
Okay, interesting. Like you say, we'll come on to the policies and optimizing packaging and more specifically within construction in a little while. But I just want to take you back and use your knowledge from other industries, if you like. And I keep saying this on every single episode, and I need to stop. But it's obvious, or it's safe to say that construction can be lagging behind a number of industries. I think that's true, but it's a little bit unfair in that there's a lot of good innovation going on in construction, but we can be stuck in more traditional ways of working. So looking further afield, we might be able to gain some knowledge and information from other industries. And when you think about packaging and waste, and I'm thinking more fast-moving consumer goods like we've been talking about, and supermarkets, which were put under scrutiny back in 2015, and they reduced their single-use plastic bags, and I think that's dropped by about 98%, but it's a bit of a forced reduction, if you like. What can we learn from other industries, or what can we learn from the mistakes that other industries have learned? Because for me, supermarkets and that kind of industry missed a massive trick in that they could have done that themselves, but it was a policy that forced them to do it. And now they're kind of taking credit for reducing the plastic waste that they produce, but they had to anyway. So going back to my question, what can we learn from the mistakes from other industries or other industries in general?
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned bags, plastic bags, single-use plastic bags in particular, because I was working for Marks and Spencer's when they introduced the charge for single-use plastic carry bags before it was policy. So it became policy a couple of years afterwards. But I was blessed to be working for a company like M&S because it did show me some of the mistakes that were being made in this environment. I think that the three biggest mistakes that predominantly food retailers were making at the time was the first one is this kind of knee-jerk reaction to the consumer demand of you must stop using plastic. So very quickly, all the retailers made promises and plans to reduce or remove plastic, in its entirety or in massive numbers, 50% reduction over 5 years, and all these sort of promises, but without really a plan or any idea of how they were going to do it. And then they were having to, over those years, having to try and figure out what they were going to do, which is very problematic, but also try and backtrack on the promises they made. And then when they did figure out what they could do with some of these problematic materials, they weren't actually going to get recycled anyway. They might get collected, they might even get sorted, but they weren't going to get turned into anything new potentially and at the end of life. So there was a lot of firefighting because of that initial knee-jerk reaction. I think, as we now know, and as this sector is learning, you could be a bit more nuanced about the promises you make and the plans that you make around plastic reduction. So that's kind of the first thing. These knee-jerk reactions, act in haste, repent at leisure, sort of thing, that retailers, I mean, rightly in a way, because they're food consumers. Your big supermarkets, it's a war out there in between them. They need to win as many customers off each other as possible. And if their customers are complaining about anything, and in this case plastic, they've got to react really quickly and prove and show that they're doing something about it. So I think a more honest, nuanced approach would have been better back then to that noise. That's the second thing is that we've now learned is that if you can really get into the data and the amount of and the real data about what you're doing and what you're placing onto the market and what exactly is that material you're placing onto the market, that can reveal loads of insights into what you can do about it. So at the time, the best data systems in every supermarket weren't really up to the job. They knew exactly what their products were and the ingredients in their products and all that stuff. But they didn't really have a good handle on the packaging and what they were placing on the market. They would pay for the goods that were packaged in a certain way, and then the packaging ends up in someone's bin, or worst case scenario ends up in the environment, and they wouldn't necessarily be able to tell you how much of it was theirs or how much potentially could have been theirs. But now, 6-7 years later, businesses are much hotter on the data, and they know in much more granular detail what they're placing on the market, what type of polymer it might be, how much recycled content it might have, how recyclable it is, which we didn't know then. I mean, some businesses were only measuring recyclability in weight and reporting 90% is recyclable, but actually when you added up all the individual bits of material, it was more like 40 or 50% of what they were placing on the market was recyclable. A very different story for the consumer, that one, isn't it? And
absolutely.
A lot of supermarkets had to backtrack and say, actually, our recycling figures aren't as good as you'd think. So data, and this sector is already learning from, good data can really provide good insights and what to do. It's mainly about making the changes that have the most impact, volume. So what has the biggest physical impact, but also the biggest reputational impact. And I'm not saying you should greenwash. I'm not saying you should ever greenwash anyone. We'll probably get into greenwashing later. But if you can do something that has a really big impact, but also a visual impact, the two work hand in hand. So I think that's something that this sector can learn from for sure.
Mm.
And then I suppose the overall. Sorry, Peter. Yeah.
I was just about to add to that greenwashing thing, and for me, yeah, there is a lot of it. But if you're, I mean, it's all about gaining attention, right? And you need to do that in the right way. The issue when you start to kind of blur the truth with not fiction, but you look at the positive charts and not the negative ones.
Yeah.
It's quite easy to get caught out. Plus, the public perception about greenwashing is being heightened. So any kind of stat will be put under scrutiny.
Yeah.
So you've got to be massively careful when you go down that route. Although you are going to choose your best numbers and figures, and there's going to be negatives behind them, but you are going to choose them. So apologies for putting in there, but that's just my marketing approach to that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And the businesses that were a bit more counterintuitive actually did quite well. I have to call out the work that Patagonia did on products, not on packaging. They said, don't buy our products. Essentially, don't buy our products because they last so long. You don't need to buy our products. But it had the flip result, didn't it? People were more attracted to their products. So there were things like that are very clever. And I'm seeing that in the marketing now of packaging. Certain brands are doing a sort of that really disruptive sort of marketing spiel. But I think coming back to the greenwashing, I think you're right. Companies are scared of saying too much. They call it green hush. They call it green hushing. So they're doing something. They're doing something good, but they're too scared to talk about it, which is almost as bad as saying something that isn't true. It's like you can't win almost. But I think
absolutely.
I think the last thing I was going to say about what can we learn? What can this sector learn from the food and fast moving goods sector is that sustainability, removing packaging or simplifying packaging or doing something better with packaging actually pays. Sustainability is good for business. And that's a really tough message normally to get across to businesses. It was at the time, but I think people are starting to understand that sustainability does make you more money ultimately, because in many cases you're stripping away the frills and you're not gilding the lily, and that there's packaging industry is guilty of doing that for sure. Over packaging, lots of print, lots of unfortunately I have to say lots of marketing around the product where perhaps you could strip it back a little bit and save money. And that's what a lot of businesses are learning now.
Yeah, and I'm not going to go off on that marketing tangent, but that's when brand becomes important. And if you look at one of the biggest users of plastic, Coca-Cola, then I'm not here to fly their flag. Far from it. Evil juice, in my opinion. But from a marketing perspective, I remember reading many years ago that they had reduced their bottle thickness by 0.2 of a mil or something like that, and it saved them hundreds of millions of pounds by just doing that tiny little tweak. And yes, they are on a mega epic global scale, aren't they? But the fact still remains, like you were saying, those changes, those tweaks, they don't have to be major and massive to make a difference to the bottom line. Yeah,
it's funny you mentioned that particular thing. We called it lightweighting in the industry. So during the early tens, as this notion of too much plastic became a thing, people were lightweighting all their packaging, making everything thinner and thinner, the gauges thinner and thinner, and then using multi materials to do the same job as a thicker material. So what we ended up with is lots of really complicated materials that were thinner, yes, lighter, yes, maybe even cheaper. But now you've got this really complicated material you're placing on the market, and now you're being told we can't recycle that; it's too complicated. So we're actually, in some cases, we're having to kind of almost rewind back to a mono material or perhaps thicker material that can be recycled. So it's very difficult. That's very difficult to do because you're adding in cost again, potentially in weight, and that's I wouldn't say that was a mistake that we could learn from in this sector, but it's something to be mindful of, that the lightweighting bit each needs to be very carefully thought about, because you might create yourself a Frankenstein's monster that then you might have to kill in 5-10 years time and something else. Do you know?
Yeah,
does that make sense?
That's my naivety there. Not thinking about the multiple components that would make that. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. It was just a small headline that I read, and I thought that's a really interesting way of looking at
Have you
packaging and
noticed?
showing the benefits.
Yeah. Do you buy milk in plastic bottles by any chance at home?
Yes. Yeah.
Have you noticed that they're getting thinner and thinner? The bottle, it's almost collapsing in your hand.
Yep. 100%. Yeah.
That's happening as over time to save money, so that we can, so the industry can have a higher yield of material, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a point at which you can't go any further, because the bottles will burst or break in the customer's hands. And I think we've reached that tipping point where we're probably about as far as we can go. But if we wanted to add more recycled content into those bottles, you might feel that they get a bit thicker. So when you add recycled material into something, you have to compensate a little bit. So there's a fine line between this lightweighting and how far you can take it.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the legislative part of the industry. So my little preamble to this topic would be that, and please correct me if anything of this is slightly off, but in this year in February, I think the packaging waste regulations came into effect. And in doing some research, there's loads of legislations going back to, or the newer ones go back to about 1990. So you can imagine how many they are. I think that was waste obligations under the Environmental Protection Act. So it's a minefield of rules and regs that are probably not that well known, to be honest, to a lot of people in construction.
Yeah.
What, in your opinion, what are the need to knows here? And do these legislations go far enough in terms of construction, packaging, and waste?
Okay, so there's only really, I say only, you're right, there's a lot of moving parts to this now. What's happened is since that original regulation back in the 90s, it was iterated again in the end of the 90s. It's only now, like 20 years later, getting a refresh. And this refresh has got many components to it. Rather than get overwhelmed, if anyone's listening in this sector, don't be overwhelmed by all of that. There's probably made three main things to think about. One of which has changed, one of which is halfway there, and one of which hasn't changed yet but will affect this sector. So the thing that has changed is this thing called the plastic tax. And if you're not familiar with the plastic tax, if you're placing plastic packaging on the market, and it does include some plastic products as well, but mainly packaging, and if you're not putting at least 30% recycled plastic in that product, you're going to pay HMRC £200 a tonne for the privilege, just over £200 per tonne for the privilege. So it's not a ban, it's a tax, and therefore anyone manufacturing or importing plastic packaging in any sector, and it includes this sector, and obviously there's a lot of volume in this sector, will then have an extra bill to pay to the taxman for the privilege of doing that. So that is affecting businesses now. And even if you're in a part of the supply chain that isn't directly paying that, so I don't know, you're a merchant, you're merchandising the products, or you're actually a builder on a building site, you're not paying the tax, but your supplier or your supplier's supplier is paying. And inevitably, they're going to pass that cost down to you eventually, of course, in the cost of goods. A pallet of bricks wrapped in plastic. Well, the plastic's more expensive now, so the bricks are going to be more expensive. Not by much, but that's very much having an effect. And why that's important, now, is because that cost could go up from 200 to nearly £1,000 per tonne in the future. Because we only know that because that's what the EU is likely to do, to ratchet that cost up for the privilege of not using recycled material. And also the percentage might go up. So it's 30%, as I said, but that percentage might creep up to 40, 50, 60%. And you either pay the tax, or there might be a stair lift, or like an elevator cost where you pay a bit more and a bit more depending how close you can get. So that we know that's coming because it's easy money for the government. That tax is easy to hike up, and the percentage is relative. But in the food system, it's very hard to put recycled content into food packaging. So they're a bit stymied with this. They can't physically put recycled material into things that are next to food. Whereas in this sector, it's a bit easier to put recycled material into a piece of plastic packaging. So construction could be the recipient of material that perhaps wouldn't have gone into something else, but could go into this packaging. So whilst it's a negative, but it's also a positive in my opinion. So the more that businesses either ask for it, specify it, or just are aware of it, is a good thing. And that launched in April last year, in 2022. So we've had a full year of this. It's gone up by inflation, but it will go up again in bigger increments in the future. So anyone dealing with a lot of plastic packaging, needs to be aware of that. That's the first one. The second one is probably as big, if not bigger, is something called extended producer responsibility. And we love an acronym in waste management and in policy, and it's EPR. EPR is the lovely acronym that you hear flying around. Or more specifically, small p EPR, which is packaging EPR, because there are other EPRs coming down the track. There'll be EPRs for textiles, EPR for small electricals, and other things coming down the track. So packaging, as I often say, is kind of the canary in the coal mine of all of these different policies that are coming. Packaging is the easy target and will be the first of many. Packaging EPR fees will basically put certain materials on the naughty step, if I can call it that, and then carry a higher cost to the producer of that packaging, or the person placing that packaging on the market. So in this sector, you're looking at those complex laminates of plastic, and things that disrupt the recycling system, that will get a higher cost. So it's a bit like a tax, but it's not a tax. It's almost saying, if you don't use this good suite of materials, you're going to be paying a hell of a lot more for the privilege of using those materials. And it's not just plastic anymore. It's any material that disrupts the recycling system, essentially. And therefore, you have to, as a business in any part of the supply chain, you have to be aware of that. Especially if you're the one placing the material on the market. So if you're stripping the material off, let's take a brick manufacturer with their name all over the plastic around the pallet of bricks. If your name's on the plastic, you're paying that extra fee, and there's nothing you can do about it. So it's big. EPR is big. And when I was in retail and we worked out the extra cost of compliance, it was 10 to 14-fold increase in cost. So if you're a business paying £1 million in compliance for the materials you place on the market, that's going back to the 1990 regulations. You're paying maybe £1 million in compensation for that. That's then going to obviously 10 to 14 million pounds instead. And we all fell off our seats when we worked it out. When we were in the retail, we were like, "Wow, this is big," Yeah. And the rubber is finally hitting the road on that. You mentioned the date this February. The data that businesses have to collect for EPR has started already. So they're having to collect their data. They're having to tell DEFRA that they produce X amount of plastic, X amount of paper, X amount of whatever else they generate. And within that, how much of that plastic is a certain polymer or another type of polymer? And also, is it recycled content or is it not recycled content? So there's lots more detail. As I said, data is going to be very, very important. And I'm sure I know you talked about data before on the podcast, and it's really, really critical in this area. So the data piece has begun. Businesses over a certain size have to report their data twice a year now. They had to do it in October, and they'll have to do it again in March for the year just gone, for the calendar year that is about to finish. And then from 2025, they'll start paying for the privilege of putting those hard to recycle materials on the market. whatever that may be. These materials on the naughty step, which have now been revealed to us, they will pay more for the privilege of doing that, and therefore their cost of compliance will go up. So the idea being that it incentivizes businesses to use different materials, or to use materials differently, use less materials, obviously, and try and make those changes. So EPR is the second one, and it's big and it's coming. The last one is around the way that you collect materials. So in England, it's called simpler recycling. In Wales, it's called workplace recycling. So if you're a builder or in construction in Wales, you're going to have to start collecting materials different from April next year. You're going to have to put all your paper and card in one bin, all your other recyclables in another bin, and all your food waste, if you've got food waste, in a separate bin. And in Wales, you have to collect textiles and electronics separately as well. So from in the construction sector, if you're only collecting recyclables in one bin, you're going to have to split them into two bins. And in our experience, there's not many building sites where this is happening very efficiently anyway. So when we look in recycling bins on a building site, they're very badly contaminated. There's a lot of cross mingling of materials. There's this weird phrase which we hear a lot called lightweight mix compactable. I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but this is what building sites tend to call their recycling bin, but it's not recycling at all. It's a mixture of all kinds of things. And the classic example is the builder might put the rubble and the bricks at the bottom and then cover it with recyclable packaging and say this is a recyclable material, honest gov. And of course then we come along and we can't do anything with it because it's contaminated. In Wales in April, and then in England from 2025, which isn't that far away, businesses are going to have to separate these materials out properly, and they'll get fined if they deliberately or perhaps accidentally mix the materials up. So this simpler recycling piece is very important, and that's kind of the third part of the recycling strategy that the government have finally now announced what it might look like in England.
So this is the thing that I love about doing the podcast, and I find fascinating in itself in any walk of life, is that you can talk about bins, you can talk about concrete, you can talk about rocks, pavements. I'm just looking around this room, umbrellas, windows, whatever, and it is always more complex and more fascinating than you give it credit for. You know, a blind's just a blind, right? You know, a table's just a table, yeah. And you don't realize how much goes into it, and that's just the policies that and you dug a bit deeper into other elements there, but that's just the policies, and it always fascinates me in terms of how detailed any industry or any small subset of that industry can go.
No, I totally agree. And I guess in this sector, what looking at packaging in a bit more detail does for businesses is help them understand the waste they might be producing from a product as well. So there's a load of different products delivered to a building site every day, isn't there? In lots of different myriad types of packaging. And when you start looking at the packaging, you start to spot lots of other opportunities that the way the products are being delivered or even made, to see, well, I could do that differently. I could do that differently. I could be more efficient over here. So it is, again, I think packaging is a good proxy to help us to be better businesses generally.
And do you think these policies and legislations, as they are now and as they're going to be, do you think they go far enough? There's too much of it. What's your take on that?
They don't quite go far enough for us at the moment. I think that we're happy. I say the industry is happy that they finally announced what all those three elements look like: the tax, the EPR, and the simpler recycling. We now know what those instruments look like. They have to be passed into law. So our first plea really is pass them into law as quickly as possible, and then iterate them and make them a bit better. So EPR is the one where we want them to look at. Whilst it's based on weight at the moment, EPR, the weight of plastic, the weight of card, the weight of metal, whatever it might be, We want them to maybe flip that and look at it from a carbon perspective in the future, rather than just weight, because weight is a very dumb measure for sustainability, really, and carbon is a much more important measure. As all these businesses are trying to go net zero, they're going to need to know what the carbon impact of anything is, and first stop is packaging. So we want them to perhaps look at a bit more circularity when an EPR finally launches in 25 for businesses. We want them to then iterate and try and over time, over the next 5 years, maybe improve the way that you report on your materials, because I think that's just the most sensible way of doing it ultimately.
Yeah. Right, Roger. I want to start wrapping this up, but I want to drill down into your expertise here for this final part of our chat, and this is all about, as we've spoken, but not on this particular topic. This is all about packaging optimization, right? So if I was to come to you within the construction industry, and I know there's huge caveats here, but if I was to come to you within the construction industry to review and give advice on the packaging that we're utilizing, where are we starting, and what's the process we'd go through to get an optimal packaging for the product?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, what we're trying to do is move all the materials up the waste hierarchy. And the waste hierarchy, as you probably know, is that sort of bottom rung of the ladder is landfill. The next rung of the ladder is energy recovery. Then you've got recycling, and then you've got reuse. And you might have one at the very top is don't do it in the first place. So don't have packaging. So refuse is often is the R I use for the last one.
Okay.
And then there is another R, actually. So there's I like to talk about rotting. So if material ends up in the environment for whatever reason, if it can rot safely in the environment, that's the least worst option. However, I think in this sector we can pretty much eradicate anything leaking into the environment, because we're in a building site, or we're in a closed environment that's being very carefully controlled. So I don't think, other than plastic blowing away in the wind and that sort of thing, I think we can control pretty much all materials. So when I think about optimization, and I think about ultimately where we want to be, is this sort of circular model of everything getting reused or recycled and back into the system many times. We've got to bite the elephant a chunk at a time. We can't just go straight from where we are now to that. So there's probably 3 things that we must do. We must start as a sector to really start to get under the skin of what we're actually dealing with materials wise. How much of each material are we dealing with, placing on the market, or indeed throwing away in the skips and the bins on the building sites. And the first way to do that is to try and get an open data. We talk about an open data source. So there are platforms where all businesses can enter their data, so everyone can see everybody else's sort of packaging data. And there is a new system for that available at the moment. And I'll share it in the show notes. But if anybody wants to investigate that and try and start collecting data in a consistent way with all of their competitors, they can do it, and it will ultimately help everyone. So it's that classification piece. Really get that data nailed down about your packaging and materials. Then you get into the really good stuff and the actual optimization piece. So this is trying to make your packaging as homogenized as possible, and this is probably against all marketing sort of wishes, isn't it? Because it's about making everything the same as possible. So if we're thinking about plastics, which is obviously one of the biggest materials out there, we're not saying get rid of plastic. We're just saying use a single type of plastic and don't bond different polymers together. And if you don't do that, then it has a much better chance of being recycled in the future, as and when that simpler recycling policy becomes mandatory. So in the future, you might be able to put your soft plastic pallet wrap and all of that stuff in a bin that then gets taken away and genuinely recycled into some more pallet wrap and shrink wrap. But if it's multi-material, if it's got different laminates of different polymers, that's going to be virtually impossible to do. It'll only ever get downcycled into something much worse. So that sort of homogenization of packaging is really important. Then I guess the next bit of that is the way that it's printed, or the way that the graphics are printed, or the names and the brands are printed on that packaging. What a lot of businesses have done in this sector already is try and strip back a bit of that branding, remove some of the print, the heavy printed materials, and the materials are often dyed a certain color. So film, if you dye a shrink film a certain color, it can only ever go back to a black piece of packaging. Whereas if it's clear or natural and has very little print on it, or 20-30% coverage of print, it will be able to go back to a product that can then go around again and again. So again, like I say, it frightens the marketeers that I talk to, but it's about sort of debranding stuff, simplifying stuff, and that optimization is important. There's also a lot of work to do around the way that products are sent to a building site. Often you see lots of individual products in individual bits of packaging being delivered all at the same time, and you think, well, couldn't all of those things just been in one box or one bag?
Yeah.
And you will save, even though a box may be this big compared to lots of little boxes this big. You think, well, that's the same amount of packaging. Well, it isn't. It's actually a lot less, because you've optimized the way that you've sent the products to the place where it needs to go. So optimization is sometimes just about the right fit of the right product, and also the right amount of products in the box as well. It's not rocket science, but it's not often thought about. Then I suppose the next thing is looking at, are there any ways that you can switch that packaging to maybe a reusable type of packaging? So if you're delivering, I don't know, let's say bricks, that's a good example. You're delivering bricks to a building site, you might have a blanket over the top, which then protects the bricks from rain, stops the bricks falling off the pallet, but the blanket goes back and gets used again and again, instead of just keep wrapping bricks in plastic, which potentially won't get recycled. And I think there's a number of opportunities in this sector where you could be a bit clever with that. It's not everything all at the same time, but you can pick off certain things that are getting delivered that you could switch to a reusable or refillable sort of solution, a tote system for bathroom products or whatever it might be. So you're delivering the product, they get used, but the thing that carried it goes back and gets used again. Like I say, it's not rocket science, but that's where we can really, once we've done the optimization piece, we can go a step further and sort of I call it from optimization to harmonization almost. So they're doing a bit more, taking that, a little bit of step further forward. That will get us to a place eventually where we can perhaps have everything that's coming into a building site as there's no waste at all, essentially, because you're reusing all the packaging essentially. That's kind of the ultimate. That's kind of a very broad brushstroke what I would suggest.
Of course, I mean it's so interesting. Just those areas where you don't even, well, it's not first in mind, in terms of reducing packaging straight away. You just think of getting rid of packaging, and that might not be the case, like you say, reusable, etc., combining products and things like that. And from the marketing perspective, my first thought when you were talking about that was the fact that, okay, well, how can we get our brand onto the actual product, or how can we get more touch points with the people that are using it? And that reusable element is that additional touch point, that single use or packaging that's just thrown away or into a standard recycle bin. You don't get that additional touch point, where if it's reusable, you're communicating in an additional part with your users, which is always a great opportunity to spark conversation and build that trust.
Yeah, for sure. And as I said at the beginning, this sector hasn't stood still on this. I think they're now getting to grips with all of this stuff. And your listeners will definitely have heard of the Supply Chain Sustainability School, who represent a number of different builders and suppliers and merchants in the industry. And they've just put a paper out called Packaging Optimization in the House Building Sector. We'll put the link in the notes, I'm sure. That they've basically gone across the whole supply chain and called out loads of great examples of packaging optimization in little pockets of activity and put it all together in one report.
Nice.
And what we hope it will do, because we help the school sort of put this together. What we hope it will do will inspire everybody else to borrow with pride of all these ideas and take them on themselves and push each other along. Because one mistake that the food retailers make again is they didn't really collaborate at the very beginning of this journey of reduction. Everyone wanted to do their own thing, and the collaboration was very limited. But once they started to collaborate, things really got motoring. So you might have heard of the UK Plastic Pact, which was a group of businesses, mainly retailers, mainly food manufacturers. Once they got together and started putting some plans together, they really got some good results across the packaging supply chain. But I think the construction industry is more likely to collaborate, aren't they, than food retail would ever collaborate.
Yeah, I think once the benefits are there, and I don't know much about food retail, but I know that in construction there are a lot of associations and federations, and that's where it's huge potential for collaborative effort. Whereas in other industries they might not have those associations as plentiful as the construction industry, because it is a diverse industry. So I'm an advocate of collaboration. I don't think it is as rife in construction as it should be, but with things like this and packaging, it is without a doubt prime for a collaborative approach and learning from each other, massively, without a doubt.
Yeah, definitely. I love a quote, and I always think about this quote. There's a guy called Peter Drucker, who was a famous management consultant, said, "There's nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency something you should not be doing at all." And that, for me, sums up where we are with packaging. There's no point optimizing the packaging if you could got rid of it in the first place or done something different.
Yeah.
So
over engineering, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Roger, thank you so much. It's been so interesting in a topic where I don't think many people appreciate the time and effort that goes into those types of things within construction, because it is the product delivered to a site that is then the product that will be the building and will forever be there. Well, for 50, 100 years or whatever, it will be there, and the rest of it is almost disregarded and not seen particularly by the general public. So thank you so much for opening our eyes and bringing your knowledge and expertise. It's very much appreciated.
My absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed it.